I wanted to discuss in this video with you just a brief overview of Asian empires in the early modern period. For most of the weeks during this course, you're going to be reading from the textbook, Worlds Apart, Worlds Together, uh, and you'll see those on the syllabus. And make sure that you're reading those prior to the date that they're listed beside. So your first reading will be for the Renaissance, and so you should do the Renaissance reading prior to coming to lecture that day. But I wanted to do this video on Asian empires because this textbook talks quite a bit about uh, these empires, and there's really just not enough time to get through them all. And I also know that some of you are still trying to acquire the course materials. You need to make sure you have Worlds Apart, Worlds Together, and that you also have this book, An American Soldier in World War One. So make sure that you have those by Monday, or at least Worlds Apart, Worlds Together. You won't need the World War One book until towards the end of the semester. This week, you should also be working on studying for your map quiz. So that's another reason that I wanted to go ahead and take the time to just walk through this lesson with you before lecture, rather than you doing independent reading as much on your own. I will link this PowerPoint so you can look through the charts I'm going to show you, and you can have an idea of what we're going to be talking about. And that's really the goal of providing these materials to you prior to the start of classes, that you already have kind of an idea when you come in what we're going to be talking about. You can ask some questions, maybe you already have some questions in mind of things you don't understand or things that you want to learn more about. And so that's the reason that we do this, so that when you're coming to lecture, these terms and these names that are a lot of times kind of weird or at least new to you, uh, maybe will stick in your mind better if you kind of are already familiar with them when you come in. Also, some people learn better from reading, of course, than they do from listening to someone speak. I tend to not use a lot of PowerPoints um, that have a lot of writing on them, so following along in the textbook and preparing for class that way can be beneficial for a lot of learners. And so, understanding the type of learner that you are will make you more successful in your college education experience. So as you're preparing for the map uh, quiz, you hopefully are familiar with some of these areas. They've changed, of course, since the 1600s. That's what the C here means, circa around 1600. So around 1600, the world looked a lot different, and the boundaries of countries, that is to say, looked a lot different than they do now. But still, nonetheless, hopefully these look similar to to the countries as they look today, and they're somewhat familiar to you. Japan, of course, by and large, the same. We're going to be talking about a period known as the Tokugawa period, which started in 1603, where Japan became centralized. And China during this time period had Ming China, which was from 1368 to 1644, and then Qing China, which is spelled Qing, from 1644 to 1911. And China's shape changed during this time period. This shows it when it was a little bit earlier on, really during the when they were ruled by the Mongols. Um, but you don't need to know that really. But anyway, China was smaller at times in their history, larger in other times in their history, and they went through changes in who ruled them. So the Ming, of which we'll talk about, was a time period when China was ruled by ethnic Chinese people. Then in Qing China, they were ethnic Manchurians, which are from the northern region of China, which at the time culturally were very different. Then there's the Mughal Empire, which by and large is what today is India and Pakistan. The Safavid Empire, which is largely in Iran, or they would have known it as Persia. In your textbook, we'll discuss it as being Persia. And then Turkey, and where it's like Saudi Arabia is now, and northern Egypt, and even Greece and Eastern Europe, all of that was part of the Ottoman Empire, which lasted from about 1200 till World War One. So really, for most of the duration of our course, The Ottoman Empire was a really important power, and we'll discuss in the course how they lost land, like Greece gained independence in the 1830s, for example. But all of these empires were very important to world history, and I wish that we had more time to talk about them. So I want you to be somewhat familiar with what the map looked like around 1600 compared to what the map looks like today on the world. But by and large, Asia hasn't changed as much as perhaps Europe has. Okay, so the first area that I want to talk to you about is, well, I actually think I'm going to do the other areas first. So China, Japan, Korea. We won't be discussing Korea as much, but it's good to have a general idea. So China, like I said, went through the Ming period where the rulers were ethnic Chinese. Prior to this period, China had been ruled by uh, the Mongols in what's known as the Yun dynasty. And the Mongols are from, I'll show you on the map, the Mongols are were from this area around on the other side of the Gobi Desert, largely. Um, and the Mongols ruled China between roughly the 1290s through uh, the 1360s, 1368. Um, and the Chinese saw this as being an outside influence ruling over them, and it was. And eventually, Emperor, well, the first emperor of Ming China staged a rebellion, and Ming China or China came under rule by itself by people that were Chinese. And they had a lot of accomplishments during this time period. They restored a lot of Chinese customs. Uh, China was ruler. The emperor lived in a forbidden city, as it was known, so establishing central power. Uh, it was also Zhang He. We'll talk about him. Was an explorer from Ming China during this time period. Eventually, the Ming though did fall to Manchurian influence or the Manchus, and that's when China was established, and they grew China in large size. This is also when China began to experience a population increase that was really unproportional. And there were a lot of cultural developments in this time period. Porcelain became even more popular. Literature kind of regrew during this time period. Japan also during this period, really starting about 1200 and moving on to 1600, went through a feudal period. You may be familiar with the feudal period in Europe, where there was really a class structure. But by and large, Japan had been a relatively divided country. The emperor didn't have any real power, and lords, which were called dynamos, had private armies, and that's when the samurai fought for them, which the samurai were a lot like knights in Europe. So the two areas, even though they didn't have any contact, went through similar periods. The samurai followed a Bushido code, as it was known, which was largely very similar to European chivalry. But eventually, by 1603, the shogunates, which were essentially military leaders that acted as prime ministers, unified Japan. The emperor became more of a symbol of unity, really, but the shogunates were the people really running the country, and they were generals, by and large, military leaders. They were very successful in protecting Japan from being ruled or being defeated by the Mongols. Of course, that was earlier on before the Tokugawa shogunate, before there was true unity. That was earlier on. But Japan was reunified into out of its feudal period eventually by the shogunate. So the shogunates had some power earlier on, like when they were defending against the Mongols, but they uh, reestablished a lot of unity, a lasting unity in the Tokugawa shogunate, which was in 1603. And uh, this time period, they had a lot of isolation. They were trying to protect Japan from European influence, from really all outside influence. Eventually, and we'll talk about this, eventually they weren't as successful in this as they had hoped. Um, but that's kind of a brief overview of the Tokugawas. Korea, uh, which is here, you can see it was very close to China and Japan. It underwent a lot of influence from both China and Japan during this time period. They adopted like Confucianism from China. Uh, Japan invaded a number of times, and that really weakened Korea's economy. Um, During Qing China, Korea essentially became a colony largely of China. Um, and as a result, it was largely isolated from uh, the rest of the world. Eventually, in the late 1800s, Japan colonized Korea, and we'll mention that briefly later on in the course. But Korea, by and large, uh, fell under the influence of China and Japan during this period. So, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Mongolia, that area of the world is known as East Asia. So, if you hear me refer to East Asia, that's what I'm referring to. Okay, now the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire geographically were really more dispersed than East Asia. Uh, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, South Asia are all represented in the Gunpowder Empires, these three empires. But what really had made them be in common is that all three of these were Islamic empires. Islam, at least for a large portion of their history, the Mughal Empire is a little different, but at least for a large portion of their history, Islam was the primary religion of these areas. And still today, of course, Islam is present in all of these areas. Uh, India, of course, still has a large number of Hindus, but there are a decent amount of Muslims, and certainly in Pakistan, but even in India. The reason that these three were known as the gunpowder empires is because they used guns and developing weaponry to conquer smaller areas. And particularly within the example of the Mughal Empire, they descended really largely from the Mongol Empire. That was a lot of influence. Akbar, for example, or Babar, I should say Babar, the first emperor of the Mughal Empire, was a descendant of Genghis Khan, who was the first emperor of the Mongol Empire. So, or the first Khan, I suppose I should say. So anyway, so the Ottoman Empire descended more directly from Muhammad and from the earlier Islamic caliphates. And they really began to build an empire in the state of Anatolia, which is in Turkey. Asia Minor is also what's that is known as. They conquered Constantinople in 1453, which was the end of the Byzantine Empire, which was really the remains of the Roman Empire. So that's kind of an important fact in history. And that led to the Renaissance, for example, in Europe, which we'll talk about later on, or at least contributed largely to it. Uh, Solomon had a lot of reformed legal codes during this period. They enslaved Christians into their army. The Jasonaries is what their armies were called. Um, Non-Muslims didn't really have all that many rights in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the Ottoman Empire conquered so many other empires. They were influenced by multiple cultures. The Safavid Empire was in Persia. Abbas was an important emperor who really helped strengthen and expand the empire. And there again, there was a lot of different cultural influences through trade. All of these were trading, specifically the Safavids and Ottomans were trading peoples, and so they had a lot of influence from other cultures. The Mughal Empire, like I said, descended really more from the Mongols. Uh, there was a lot of Muslims and Hindus, so a lot of the Hinduism really never gave away during the Mughal Empire. There was a tax placed on non-Muslims. They had important emperors like Akbar the Great, who contributed a lot to the cultural development of the society. There were, and Akbar was really more tolerant towards non-Muslims. There were other emperors like Aurangzeb who were less tolerant of non-Muslims. There was also a lot of art during this period. Shah Jahan, for example, built the Taj Mahal. Uh, so a lot of cultural contributions during this time period. So hopefully that gives you a brief overview so that when we talk about during the next two lectures, first the East Asian empires and then the gunpowder empires, he'll have kind of an idea of what we're talking about, and you won't come in completely uh, uh, in the dark, so to speak, since I know you probably didn't talk about these topics all that much in high school, if at all. And so make sure you're studying for your map quiz and feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'll see you soon.